Surrender came without spectacle. No siege engines battered Alexandria's walls. No flames consumed the harbors. On the 1st of August, 30 BC, the city simply opened its gates. What followed was not conquest, it was inventory. Cleopatra remained in her palace, but the palace was no longer recognizable. Roman forces didn't storm through doorways. They reconfigured them. Passages were reassigned. Chambers were reclassified. What had been corridors of state became supervised pathways. What had been private quarters became monitored zones. The transformation was methodical. Soldiers stationed themselves at measured intervals throughout the complex. Ancient accounts describe specific instructions. Prevent any autonomous action. Inspect all provisions. Remove implements that could serve purposes beyond their designated function. Reflective surfaces disappeared. Grooming instruments were confiscated. Correspondence was screened. This wasn't imprisonment as traditionally understood. It was ecological control, the management of a living specimen within carefully maintained parameters. For 2 decades, Cleopatra had wielded authority across territories spanning from the Levantine coast to Libya's western reaches. She'd conducted multilateral negotiations, directed maritime forces, administered agricultural distribution systems during shortage years. She communicated fluently in 9 languages. Her expertise encompassed diplomatic protocol, religious ceremonial requirements, and military logistics. None of this knowledge transferred to her current circumstances. Guards following predetermined orders couldn't be persuaded. Soldiers operating under external command structures couldn't be directed. Relationships that had once generated leverage no longer existed in any operational sense. Every mechanism she'd previously employed to maintain position, strategic timing, resource allocation, relationship cultivation, calculated postponement, had been extracted from the situation. What remained was corporeal presence. Rome had already assigned exact value to that presence. While Cleopatra remained under observation, her public identity was undergoing systematic reconstruction. This process had initiated years prior. Following the naval engagement at Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's information apparatus had begun reshaping how Cleopatra registered in Roman consciousness. Official documentation omitted her formal titles. Public addresses characterized her not as a sovereign but as external interference. Coinage ceased featuring her likeness. Written records emphasized personal influence over governmental capacity. Her detention didn't create this narrative framework. It finalized it. For Roman audiences, she was no longer the monarch who'd stabilized a fragmenting administration, the descendant of Macedonian conquerors, the co-ruler who'd maintained Egypt's coherence through successive crises. She had been reclassified, enemy of the state, documented, verified, prepared for presentation. Roman ceremonial law required physical evidence for official victory celebrations. Triumph wasn't declared, it was demonstrated. Defeated opponents were exhibited in prescribed sequence. First their armaments, then their accumulated wealth, finally their leadership. Cleopatra was being preserved for that sequence. But the process demanded more than her continued survival. It required her conversion from governing authority to display object. On August 3rd, 2 days after Roman forces occupied the palace, Cleopatra was permitted an encounter with Octavian. This wasn't negotiation. It was assessment. The meeting occurred within her own palace, but the space had been reconfigured by Roman personnel. Guards positioned at every access point. Furniture rearranged. The environment she'd controlled for 20 years now served Roman operational purposes. Octavian arrived accompanied by scribes, not advisors. The interaction was being documented. Fragmentary accounts suggest Cleopatra attempted to contextualize her alliance with Marcus Antonius. She produced fiscal documentation. She indicated willingness to grant access to royal treasuries. She proposed arrangements regarding her children's welfare. Octavian received this information. He neither rejected nor accepted her propositions. He acknowledged them, then departed. The entire encounter lasted under 60 minutes. No agreements materialized. No commitments were articulated. No schedule was established. Yet the meeting accomplished something crucial. It confirmed Cleopatra still believed outcomes remained undetermined. And that belief served Rome's purposes perfectly. As long as she perceived resolution as pending, she would maintain compliant behavior. She wouldn't attempt departure. She wouldn't organize opposition. She would wait. Waiting was precisely what Rome required. Each day of waiting represented another day to prepare the spectacle. Ancient sources indicate Cleopatra interpreted the encounter favorably. She perceived Octavian's measured response as openness. She read his restraint as potential flexibility. But his restraint wasn't flexibility. It was technique. He'd already determined the outcome. He simply hadn't disclosed the timeline. Cleopatra's position had never rested exclusively on her own authority. It rested on continuity. Her eldest son, Caesarion, publicly acknowledged as Julius Caesar's biological heir, represented an equation Rome couldn't exhibit. His existence complicated Octavian's narrative architecture. If Caesar had a legitimate successor, Octavian's claim to Caesar's political inheritance became disputable. A living son carrying both royal and Roman lineage created potential focal point for alternative loyalties. Caesarion was 17 when Alexandria fell. He'd been evacuated southward before the city's surrender, directed toward the Red Sea with instructions to reach India if necessary. Sources diverge on whether he returned voluntarily or was intercepted. What's certain, he was executed shortly thereafter. Specific methods aren't detailed in surviving accounts. The decision originated with Octavian. His advisor Arius is recorded stating, "Too many Caesars is not advantageous." Caesarion was removed from calculation. The remaining children were not. Cleopatra's three younger offspring with Marcus Antonius, Alexander Helios, 10 years old, Cleopatra Selene, 10, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, 6, were taken into Roman custody alive, not as prisoners in conventional terms. They were reassigned. Roman practice didn't automatically execute children of defeated opponents. It absorbed them. They were transported to Rome, placed in designated households, raised under Roman supervision. Cleopatra Selene would eventually marry Juba II, Rome's appointed king of Mauritania. She would govern as queen, mint currency bearing her image, produce heirs who would integrate into Roman imperial lineage. But that future wasn't presented to Cleopatra as reassurance. It was presented as removal. Her children would continue existing, but not as Egyptians, not as Ptolemies, not as inheritors of her dynasty. They would proceed as Roman assets. This clarified her situation's actual parameters. Rome didn't need to eliminate her children to neutralize them. It only needed to relocate them. Once relocated, her leverage evaporated. The separation occurred incrementally. First, the children were moved to different palace sections, then assigned Roman attendants. Then their routines were restructured. Then they began Latin instruction. Cleopatra was permitted to see them, but only at designated intervals. Those intervals became less frequent, not as punishment but as transition. The children required detachment from Egyptian identity before integration into Roman society could proceed. That detachment necessitated reduced maternal influence. By the time Cleopatra died, her children had already been transferred to separate facilities. They weren't present at her death. They were already Roman property. Octavian's intention was evident from Alexandria's surrender. Cleopatra would be transported to Rome alive, displayed, then archived. Roman triumphs followed rigid procedural sequences. They weren't celebrations, they were bureaucratic demonstrations of conquest. Every element was catalogued. Every participant had designated positioning. The order was inflexible. Magistrates and Senate members, trumpeters, carts bearing spoils, visual representations of conquered territories, sacrificial animals, captive leaders in chains, the victorious general, the army. Cleopatra would have walked in position 6, not immediately, not first. Last among the captives, after subordinate officials, after symbolic figures, after anyone presentable as lesser than her. The spacing between positions was intentional. It allowed crowds to process each element. It generated anticipation. It extended humiliation's duration. Roman triumphs could continue for hours. Cleopatra would have spent that entire duration walking through streets, restrained, visible, powerless. The route was predetermined. From Campus Martius through Circus Maximus, past the Forum, ascending to Jupiter's temple on the Capitoline. Every step witnessed, every witness Roman. But this sequence required preparation. Captives needed transport from conquered territories to Rome, journeys consuming weeks by sea. They required secure holding near the city. They needed to be kept alive, presentable, unable to escape. For Cleopatra, this meant months of waiting. Not in Alexandria. In transit, under guard, without agency, without timeline. Here, Rome's calculation became precise. If Cleopatra died before the triumph, proceedings could continue but would lack their central figure. If she died during the triumph, the spectacle would be disrupted. If she died afterward, she'd be archived as completed transaction. Rome preferred the third option but found the second acceptable. Only the first, death before display, represented failure. That timeline created pressure. Each day Cleopatra remained alive and unexhibited extended the risk she might exit the process on her own terms. Octavian knew she was calculating the same timeline, so he accelerated preparations. Ships were commissioned, transport schedules drafted, holding facilities in Rome inspected. The triumph tentatively scheduled for the following year. But Cleopatra wasn't informed of these preparations. She was maintained in procedural uncertainty, because uncertainty prevents planning, and without planning, resistance cannot be organized. On August 10th, 30 BC, approximately 10 days after Alexandria's occupation, Cleopatra died. The method remains contested. Ancient sources provide conflicting accounts. Plutarch describes an ASP concealed in a fig basket. Dio Cassius suggests poison. Strabo notes no snake was discovered. Some historians propose a hollowed hairpin. Others suggest complicity from guards. The mechanism is uncertain. The context is not. Cleopatra died before transport to Rome could be executed. Rome's response to that death reveals what her captivity had actually been designed to accomplish. When informed of her death, Octavian didn't alter the triumph schedule. He adjusted the presentation. On August 13th, 29 BC, nearly 1 year after Cleopatra's death, Octavian celebrated his triple triumph in Rome. The first honored his Illyrian victories. The second honored Actium. The third honored Egypt's conquest. For the Egyptian triumph, Cleopatra appeared not physically but as image. Plutarch records a large effigy carried through streets depicting her on a couch with an ASP attached. The representation was sufficient. Roman law didn't require the actual body of a defeated enemy, only verifiable evidence of defeat. The effigy provided that evidence with additional advantages. A living Cleopatra might have displayed resistance, refused to walk, spoken to crowds, created unpredictable moments. A representation couldn't. It was controllable, predictable, repeatable. But the effigy wasn't displayed alone. Beside it, Cleopatra's 3 surviving children were paraded through streets. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, ages 11, 11, and 7, walked in chains through Rome while a statue of their mother was carried behind them. They weren't harmed. They were evidence. Evidence that Egypt wasn't merely conquered but absorbed. This absorption didn't require Cleopatra's cooperation. It only required her absence. Rome didn't need to erase Cleopatra from history. It needed to control which version survived. For 2 millennia, the dominant image wasn't the multilingual diplomat who stabilized a collapsing dynasty, not the administrator who managed famine relief and economic reform, not the naval commander who deployed 60 ships at Actium. It was the seductress, the foreign threat, the tragic lover, the woman on the couch with the ASP. That version was constructed in Rome, displayed in Rome, transmitted through Roman sources. And Cleopatra wasn't present to contest it. Even her death became part of the narrative Rome chose to tell. The ASP, symbol of Egyptian royalty, repurposed as instrument of her destruction. The pharaoh killed by her own symbol. That story was too perfect to be accidental. It was designed. Whether or not it was true became irrelevant. The story served Rome's purposes better than truth. It showed Cleopatra as theatrical, irrational, self-destructive. It positioned her death as admission of defeat. It transformed calculated exit into romantic gesture. That transformation endured. Cleopatra's final weeks weren't defined by drama. They were defined by process. Surveillance without interrogation. Detention without charge. Delay without resolution. Time without agency. Roman soldiers didn't torture her. Didn't humiliate her publicly. Didn't force confessions. They simply removed her ability to determine outcomes. Once that ability was removed, her physical presence became optional. She could die and the triumph would proceed. She could live and the triumph would proceed. The outcome was identical. Cleopatra governed Egypt for 21 years. She outlasted rival siblings, Roman civil wars, political realignments. She negotiated with Julius Caesar, commanded Marcus Antonius's fleet, stabilized an empire fracturing at every border. But in her final days, she couldn't negotiate, command, or stabilize anything. She could only wait. Her children survived. Her dynasty didn't. Her image endured. Her authority didn't. She was preserved in history, but only in the version Rome chose to archive. That version was displayed in a triumph she never attended, recorded in sources she couldn't correct, transmitted through centuries she couldn't influence. The woman who spoke 9 languages had no voice in how she was remembered. The ruler who commanded fleets was reduced to representation on a cart. The strategist who negotiated with Caesar was rewritten as seductress. All of this happened not through violence but through substitution. Rome didn't destroy Cleopatra. It replaced her with an image it could control, a narrative it could repeat, a legacy it could archive. History doesn't always destroy its enemies with violence. Sometimes it simply files them away.